Latith, Theoquatol, Mathxwí, Talitsaquah, Semá. Good morning, school district staff. I'd like to welcome everyone to the traditional and unceded territory of the Semá and Mathxwí people. I'd like to thank the staff here for participating in walking forward together. This event here really highlights the truth and reconciliation aspect that's taking part on behalf of the school district and the First Nation communities here in South Tamuk. Truth and reconciliation is a very important part for us as Indigenous people. One piece that I would want to share with everyone is about our truth and reconciliation. Here in Canada, Canada has had a lot of history in the last 300 years with its Indigenous people. And a lot of Canada's history has always outlined the point of settlement, whether it was the Doctrine of Discovery, the British North American Act, different highlights in Canada's history. And one thing that was always failed to mention is the Indigenous peoples, and the Indigenous peoples in relationship with the land. And before the settlers came here, what did that look like? What was the ancestors' relationship with the land, and how were they utilizing it? What were they utilizing for fruits and vegetables? And what was our relationship with this place that we call British Columbia, or South Tamuk? That's one thing that we want our generation underneath us to learn as our children, to learn about their culture, to learn about their traditions, to learn about their songs and their dances, because that's very much a part of the land and very much a part of Canada, just as much as the maple leaf is a part of Canada, just as much as every citizen that's out here is a part of Canada, just as much as, I'd like to say, but our national anthem is a part of Canada. We're doing so much to make this country a greater country, and by putting our story and our truth and our reconciliation and our matters is very important to us as Indigenous people. Because our story matters, our lives matter. I'd like to thank all the school district staff for taking such a healthy risk and taking time out of your day and coming over to learn a bit about our history, to learn a bit about our culture, to learn a bit more about what Canada really is. And by learning, you're helping Indigenous communities, you're helping Indigenous students, you're helping all students get a much better grasp on what type of country we are and what we're going to be teaching and what our future here in Canada is going to look like. But I'd like to thank all the staff here, and I'd like to thank the school district for putting on such an amazing event. With that, I'd like to say, Kwasai, si etamatzel, si amsiaya, si etala. Lahai.
Swale. Brenda Morgan is my traditional name. I've been fortunate enough in the last few years to get 2 traditional names. One is Chichalatia Mathxwí, and that has to do with taking care of the children. My second one is Yamatia, and that has to do with the traditional lands of Mathxwí. I understand you are here as teachers to understand us a little bit more. And the one thing that I want the message to be out there is, please don't be backwards to utilize our Indigenous support workers. You know, I'm a student that used to enter 3 different schools in 1 year, and I knew what it was like to walk into a room and everybody knew. I could just feel everybody knew what my entire life was all about. And it really did scar me. So every different school I walked into, it was harder and harder and harder. And needless to say, I became a dropout. I was a dropout because I didn't feel like I was being heard, felt, even cared about in the school back when I was there. So all I would beg for each and every one of you to do is to be able to recognize the pain that we are packing. Some of us are 3 and 4 generations deep from the residential school. That's heart-wrenching stuff. And when you have no food and your parents don't know how to say I love you, it becomes very difficult to hold your head high and walk in and feel like you belong, feel like you even deserve to learn. You know, there's just so many questions in our head. Are we worthy to be here? And I say this from the bottom of my heart because I was there. And today I'm very proud to say that I worked very hard to make sure my children went to two schools through their entire lives. I worked very hard to do that. And now my grandchildren are in that same boat. But my grandchildren are able to feel less pain than even my children felt. While I was raising my children as a young mom, they knew I was hurting. They knew it was the beginning for me to start unraveling everything that I'd been through as a child. But we got through that as a young family. And I'm very proud to say that my grandchildren get to feel less pain. They get to hold their head high and be proud. They go looking for Indigenous support workers now. They go looking to be part of all the artwork in the schools. They go looking to be part of the choir. They go looking to be part of anything the school's offering. That's a big change. And some of us are very lucky to have made that change. But I look to my right and I look to my left and I see my cousins and I don't see that same growth happening. And that's not at any fault of their own. That's just still the residential school era. They don't know how to use their voice. And unfortunately, our children don't know how to use their voice. So as proud as I am as a grandmother, as a leader, I need to still be here for everybody in my community. So I stand here proudly and wish you well today. And I just ask that we always have an open mind and an open heart and just listen. Thank you.
A Kwasami directly translates in Halkamalam to "it is good that you came." It is the Stalo word we use for welcome.
The Welcome Project was created by myself, Darlene McDonald, the District Principal for Indigenous Education, and my colleague Christine Seymour, the District Principal of Indigenous Education from Fraser Cascade School District.
Every day in classrooms and district sites, our employees work to ensure that every student is successful. Additionally, we all play an integral role in ensuring that we create a positive and welcoming environment for our Indigenous students and staff. Understanding the history of our community is an important step that we can take together in this learning journey. Our school districts are located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Stalo people. Stalo history, culture, teachings, and stories are passed down orally. These stories tell us of a time prior to 10,000 years. Stalo stories tell us that Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, that they have always been here. Evidence of this can be found at Hétum, one of Canada's oldest archaeological sites.
Who are the Stalo? When I think about this question, I think about the day I asked my dad about the laws of our people. We were walking in the forest and he turned around and pointed to everything around us and said, the laws are all around us. We are Hwomuk. We are the land. We are Tamuk. In our language, Hwomuk means still a person. Tamuk, which is our word for land, means the people. The interconnectedness between these two words displays our worldview and what my dad was talking about when he said the laws are all around us. Everything around us is our people, and we take care of everything like we would take care of one another.
Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to Mathxwí First Nation. Today we are going to share the Mathxwí multi-purpose song. I'll be singing it with the annex students, and also we're going to sing it to make our elders proud and the viewers that are going to be watching this. Thank you.
Language is important, and it frames how we think about the world. Many different terms have been used to refer to the original people of Canada. The school district used the term Aboriginal for a long period of time. However, in 2019, the Abbotsford School District emerged as a leader in public education. We became one of the first school districts in the province to shift our language and use Indigenous, which is a direct reflection of our commitment statement.
Indigenous means sprung from the land. It draws an important connection to the land that all Indigenous people have, and as such, using the term Indigenous moves us in the direction and spirit of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which highlights the importance of fostering equity, partnerships, good faith, and mutual respectful relations.
Indigenous is an inclusive umbrella term for the three distinct groups of Indigenous people in Canada: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. First Nations people are Indigenous people who have always been here, below the 55th parallel north, and have been caretakers of this land. Inuit people are stewards of the land above the 55th parallel north, and have always been here. Métis are descendants of a family line directly connected to a Métis union, people of mixed European and Indigenous ancestry.
Status with First Nations people is directly linked to the Indian Act. Someone with status would have registered with the federal government of Canada. Whether someone has status or not, it does not impact their First Nations identity. Membership with Inuit people is directly connected to the Nunavik Inuit Land Claim Agreement Act. If their community has agreed to the act, they may be a member. Whether someone has membership or not, it does not impact their Inuit identity. Citizenship with Métis people is connected to genealogy to an original Métis union and settlement. Citizenship is determined by directly connecting those family lineage lines and connecting with a local Métis community. Whether someone has citizenship or not, it does not impact their identity as being Métis.
Hi, I'm Korky Neufeld, Chair of the Abbotsford Board of Education. On behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you all to this virtual professional development session dedicated to the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. In 2019, our board signed an enhancement agreement for Indigenous students. This agreement supports the educational experiences and achievements of Indigenous students in the Abbotsford School District. Numerous consultations with Indigenous rights holders, community members, and families were held to ensure their voices served as the framework's foundation and guided the three key goals: student success, cultural identity, and equity and access. Since then, our school district has invested efforts to infuse Indigenous education and First Peoples principles of learning into the classroom, our buildings, and throughout the meetings and events. We've celebrated over 30 Indigenous students throughout our Indigenous Role Model program, and we've witnessed greater levels of Indigenous students graduating high school than ever before. We've seen our Indigenous support workers collaborating with classroom teachers to revitalize the Hulkamelam language and infuse cultural teachings into the curriculum. We've made progress as an organization and have milestones to celebrate. But, like many Canadians across this country, we are still learning the truths about our shared history and are all on our own learning journeys. We must take the initiative to expand our understanding, seek out diverse perspectives, and engage in meaningful and respectful conversations with one another. We hope that today's session will help us in this regard. We extend our gratitude to our knowledge keeper and cultural advisor, Dr. Gwendolyn Point, Semá First Nation, Mathxwí First Nation, and the Fraser Valley Métis Association for sharing their voices and guiding us on this important day of learning. Thank you.
The Indigenous Education Council was established as a governance structure supporting the work of the Indigenous Department in our school district. Council members include leaders from Semá First Nation, Mathxwí First Nation, the Fraser Valley Métis Association, and our knowledge keeper, Dr. Gwendolyn Point.
The Abbotsford School District acknowledges historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public educational institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching and community engagement.
The Abbotsford School District has worked with Indigenous leaders throughout the community to sign an Education Enhancement Agreement for Indigenous students. The latest agreement that was signed in 2019 is a collection of the voices of the Indigenous community who communicated with the school district through numerous consultations about their wants, needs, and challenges for their children. 3 major goals focused on student success, ensuring our students were supported on their pathway to graduation and with their reading levels and career aspirations. Cultural identity, celebrating the diversity and rich history of Indigenous peoples, their accomplishments, the unique culture, systems, and language. And finally, equity and access, looking deeply at how to address and remove systemic bias and racism.
The Mamala Out Indigenous Education Centre is the central hub for Indigenous education in the Abbotsford School District. This location includes offices for staff that facilitate Indigenous programming in each of our schools, a clothing room, and the Ray and Millie Silver Library. The centre also provides space for community partners like the Fraser Valley Métis Association. Mamala Out is a Hulkamelam word that means children's house. Parents and Stalo elders from Sumas First Nation asked Coquitlam Cultural Education Centre to provide a name for the Indigenous programs throughout the Abbotsford School District. The name reminds us to create a place where all children, First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and non-Indigenous children feel safe and are treated with respect.
The logo was designed by Ray Silver, a prominent Stalo elder. The elements of the logo signify the following. The raven is the trickster who takes the time to teach us what we need to know, a shapeshifter that teaches perspective. The woman, as the matriarch, is the holder of knowledge and the keeper of the culture. The raven is protecting the woman by covering her with its wing so the culture, at the center, remains safe.
Canada is an incredibly rich, multicultural society, and Indigenous peoples are an essential piece of the fabric of our country's history. The more we learn about Indigenous worldviews and perspectives, and the first people of this land, the more well-rounded and positive global citizens we can become.
Whether you work in a classroom, at a district site, or support our organization in a different role, it's important that we learn who our Indigenous students and staff are and uplift their voices and lived experiences. Take time to get to know them as individuals. Where are they from? What are their strengths? Who are the local people of this territory? They are our students and our employees. learn their stories, celebrate their achievements, and become an ally of support. Intergenerational trauma will continue to be a reality for some of our Indigenous students and staff as we continue to move through truth and reconciliation, uncovering new truths about Canada's dark history and our actions moving forward. As such, it is important that we work to create safe physical spaces for Indigenous students and employees in our school district.
How do we do that? By getting to know our students and colleagues as individuals, by uplifting their voices to help them see themselves in a positive space where they feel like they can safely share their experiences and their culture is reflected and celebrated. Did you know? There were 59 Indigenous languages in Canada pre-contact. There were 39 Indigenous languages in BC alone. There are 3 fluent Indigenous languages in Canada now: Cree, Inuktitut, and Ojibwe. The Halkomelem language has 1 fluent speaker left, Elder Elizabeth Phillips. With hard work and commitment, local nations are reclaiming their language. Our commitment statement influenced a recent reclaiming of Indigenous language in our school names by renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities and through correcting miseducation. The English mistranslation of the place name for Semá as Sumas and Mathxwí as Mathxwí was represented in 2 of our elementary school names. Under the guidance and advice of our Indigenous Education Council, as well as the chiefs from Semá First Nation and Mathxwí First Nation, and along with the support of our school board, Upper Sumas Elementary's name was reclaimed as Samath Elementary, and Mathxwí Elementary was reclaimed as Mathxwí Elementary in 2022. Our newest school, Irene Kelleher Totil Autuk, was named under the guidance of community members from Samath First Nation. Irene Kelleher was the first Indigenous teacher in British Columbia. Totil Autuk in Halkomelem means house or place of learning, valuing the Halkomelem language on the traditional territory with our school name.
What is a highlight for you related to Indigenous learning? In Partners, share an example, a story, or a connection to the work you are doing in your school or district site.
It's important for us as educators, and myself included, to think about what has shaped my perspectives, my values, and by knowing the past and knowing the influences, and then perhaps helping me understand my own bias, so that by doing that critical self-examination, then I as an educator can help the learners do the same thing.
Professional standards guide and advance the work of educators in our province, communicating knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values, as well as our responsibility to contribute towards truth, reconciliation, and healing. Acknowledging the history and contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada. Introduced in 2019, Standard 9 is the unprecedented commitment of BC educators to truth, reconciliation, and healing, ensuring all students have the opportunity to learn Indigenous perspectives throughout all subjects.
The creation of Standard 9 was very important to address the First Peoples principle of learning, as well as to address more diversity, equity, and inclusion in our system.
Standard 9 sends a strong and positive message that educators play an important role in responding to the needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit learners, families, and communities, creating systemic change in BC schools and supporting improved outcomes to advance reconciliation.
I think it's really important for educators to think of it as kind of a learning journey. It is a very exciting time in the educational system where Indigenous perspectives are now a part of the curriculum at each grade level and subject area.
When I was younger, getting those those looks because I'm brown and I'm different, I was, doubting myself. It's like, why do I have to be different? And it was hard, but that's when I realized that racism exists and it's living. Teachers can make an honest effort and actually show that they want to do it instead of feeling like they have to do it, because we don't know, but we can feel.
With residential schools being such a fresh wound in Canada's past, and it being something that's passed on pretty generationally, I know a lot of Indigenous students and some of my Indigenous friends are still pretty directly affected by it. I think it's a really important thing to learn about so they can feel heard and understood in the classroom.
Education is key to reconciliation, and educators are essential role models for change.
It's our responsibility to uplift voices of those who have not been able to use their voices in our community. There's a lot of sensitivities around the topics that we're discussing, and it's important to be able to approach that and honor it carefully.
There are so many resources and so many connections that you can find even online to be able to integrate that history and that culture into your classroom.
All subject areas are open to having Indigenous perspectives brought in. All subject areas can be accessible.
A lot of Indigenous students here are reconnecting with their culture.
Standard 9 sends a strong and positive message that every educator has an important role to play in creating pedagogy that responds to the needs of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit learners, families, and communities.
I have to come to everything with humility and openness. I have to be comfortable asking for help, letting go of this idea in our education system that people have to have all the answers and we have to have it all figured out.
A lot of that curriculum, you don't have to be Indigenous to teach it. And if you don't know what it's about, then do like you would if you were teaching something in physics you didn't totally understand. Look it up, learn about it. And sometimes some of this you might be learning with the students.
I thought, what's the thing that you can do that really is community building, is going to get us all connected? And I did my best to match up with something that was First Nation in content.
This is part of a larger focus on creating systemic change in BC's education system that will support improved outcomes for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit learners and advance reconciliation.
So this sentence up here is a Sinchothan language phrase that means this is cedar. Incorporating these sort of Indigenous teachings is important because it gives Indigenous students a sense of belonging here, that their traditions and their culture are just as important as everyone else's.
Today I'm working with a group of grade 4 and 5 students on a dance that we are creating sung in Hunkameetnam, which is an Indigenous language. It's typically something I've shied away from because Indigenous dances are so sacred and it's not a part of my history. So we decided to go at it from that emotional perspective. Kids feel things differently when they do things through the arts and they learn at a deeper level.
You can start taking steps now. Standard 9 is a natural extension to nearly every subject across BC's K-12 curriculum.
It's something that we need to strive for in the system. It just doesn't happen overnight.
You just need to appreciate you're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. It's part of making progress. But no mistake is greater than not taking the steps to bring Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum and not making the effort to have the students that we need to serve recognize and see themselves in our education system and feel validated and be successful.
We're all different, but in many ways we're also the same. So I feel proud to be Indigenous.
Foundational education is to make reconciliation part of the fabric of our society. Standard 9 means that current and future generations of school children will come through our education system with a firm grounding on why reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is so important to the future of our province. Find resources online and connect your students' learning with the heritage, culture, and contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada.
Do the best you can, but do it. Don't let your fears and your worried about being disrespectful stop you from moving forward.
Well, te ia talato, shaishkwa te homo te squee and halkamel the homo te stalo. My traditional name is Shaishkawit and the language we speak here is Halkamila. And I really want to thank Abbotsford School District for inviting me here to their professional session with the theme of walking forward together. You know, at this time in our Canadian history, it's really important. We all know because of media and the attention that was given when the 213 children were found at Tecumseh 2 years ago. It was really a difficult time for many of us, especially my parents' generation and grandparents' generation that lived through residential school, and my generation. So we have 3-4 generations that went to residential school. And I grew up with those stories of the children not coming home. So the notion of walking forward together is really important. And I thank each and every one of you. And my request is that you listen. Listen to what's going to be shared with you. But my grandmother said, don't just listen here. Anybody can do that. Rather listen here and here. As well, to have an open mind. An open mind. The elders told us, you cannot change what you don't acknowledge. And if you forget anything or everything that's been shared with you, I hope you remember this, is that walking together, in my view, is important, and that we all take responsibility for the future. We can't change what happened in the past, but we can accept the responsibility to create a better future for our children. And it starts with each one of us. So with that in mind, I know a lot of good work has been done in education, in British Columbia, in the education system. And I've witnessed firsthand the work done here in Abbotsford School District, especially by the Indigenous department. But until every Canadian takes the time to learn and accepts the responsibility, in my view, that's the only time that our children coming behind us will have an opportunity to enjoy their lives free of discrimination, free of racism. So thank you. Please, again, listen with both your ears and with your heart. And let's walk towards let's amata, let's athala, one mind and one heart. Eta mata, eta thala, have a good mind and a good heart. Komta mata, komta thala, have a strong mind and a strong heart. And what does that mean? A strong mind and a strong heart. It means doing what you need to do, to shkwalawan in a good way. So ti'i talatal, thank you.
In the past 10 years, we have seen growth in our truth and reconciliation efforts and actions in education, but the realities of Canada's dark history continues to come to light. To understand where we are now, we need to reflect on the long-term impacts of government laws and the implementation of the Indian Act and the ongoing and current effects of residential schools in Canada. Indigenous people were the first inhabitants of Canada. As settlers from Europe arrived to the country, they destroyed the Indigenous way of life through colonization and government restriction laws. The implementation of laws impacted all aspects of Indigenous life and well-being, including health, family structures, language and culture, social economic conditions, access to services, among others. Residential schools certainly had a devastating impact on Indigenous children, families, and society, but this was only one layer of colonization.
Many Métis people were forcibly removed from their lands and lived in road allowance communities located on Crown land adjacent to roadways. These makeshift communities created further barriers for Indigenous peoples to access essential municipal services like schools, stable employment, and hospitals.
The Indian Act, which was enacted in 1876, allowed the government to control every aspect of First Nations life: Indian status, land, resources, wills, education, band administration, freedom of movement, and more. The Act was aimed at ensuring First Nations peoples followed the European way of life. While Inuit and Métis communities did not fall under the Indian Act, there were many colonial policies that forced children into residential schools.
The Act made it illegal for Indigenous people to practice religious ceremonies. If they gathered in groups of more than 3 people, they would be arrested. Cultural gatherings, including potlatch, powwows, and the Sundance, were forbidden. The government made every effort to eradicate Indigenous ways of being. There was resistance and resilience among Indigenous people, and during this time, many cultural ceremonies were hidden and practiced secretly. The Act also made it illegal for Indigenous communities to hire lawyers or bring about land claims against the government without the government's consent. It also impacted the right of Indigenous people to vote. The first people of this land did not have the right to vote in Canada until 1961. One of the most damaging impacts of government restriction laws and colonization were the implementation of Indian residential schools.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk, and I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert Indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan. They targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Guayastums. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide us sustenance. And from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, and violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There were over 150,000 little children. And the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996 in Saskatchewan. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have this shared history for which we all are responsible for. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was submitted, I was in the room when Justice Murray Sinter, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, "Canada, you have committed cultural genocide," there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said, survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, "I'm sorry," and then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, "I'm sorry." Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up as we move toward a more equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that Truth and Reconciliation is Canada.
Indigenous families were forced by law to send their children to residential schools. Those who resisted faced going to prison. Over the years, stories have been shared that the Indian agent would arrive after the summer to pick up the children and transport them in cattle trucks to school. Children received minimal education. They were often used as domestic labor, such as working as farmhands or domestic help in homes. Their identities were stripped from them. The children were assigned a Christian name or sometimes only a number. Food was scarce, and children suffered from malnutrition. In fact, there were reports of experiments conducted on children to see how little food a human could survive on. The hunger was real and constant for many students. Over the years that residential schools were open, thousands of children died. Disease and illness were rampant in the schools, and many students became very ill from life-threatening diseases, including tuberculosis, measles, and influenza. Many who attended these institutions report experiencing physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual abuse. For decades, Indigenous elders have shared stories of children who mysteriously disappeared at residential school. Families were often never informed, and children whose deaths were not reported were not laid to rest respectfully. Churches and the government ignored these allegations, and their stories were not believed.
Although Métis and Inuit were not part of the Indian Act, they were still impacted by the Indian residential and day school systems. Métis experiences varied greatly from community to community. Many public schools refused Métis students because they were Indigenous. Yet some Indian residential and day schools refused to accept any Métis children as they didn't have Indian status. This created a gap in formal education for thousands of children. Inuit experiences at Indian residential schools were also complex. They were displaced over extreme distances, residing there for years without traveling back home.
In May 2021, the Kamloops Tishwepnik First Nation, where the former Kamloops Residential School was located, announced the uncovering of over 215 children's remains. Since then, Indigenous investigations across the country have found evidence of more than 1,800 confirmed unmarked graves at former residential school sites, with thousands more anticipated to be discovered in the months and years ahead.
What is the 60s Scoop? The 60s Scoop happened throughout Canada from the 1960s to the late 80s. Child welfare authorities scooped 20,000 Indigenous children from their families. Most of the children were adopted by white families. Many were taken without their mother's knowledge and sent to other provinces, the US, and even Europe. Authorities said they were acting in the children's best interests. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report stated the 60s Scoop, quote, adversely affected parenting skills and the success of many Aboriginal families. Critics say it was a racist effort to assimilate Indigenous Canadians, and those who lived through it say they were robbed of their cultural identity. In 2015, the Manitoba government took responsibility.
I would like to apologize on behalf of the province of Manitoba for the 60s Scoop.
But the federal government has never apologized. Today, survivors are bringing multiple lawsuits to courts across Canada.
Our local Indigenous nations were traditionally led by matriarchs. Colonial laws and residential schools worked to dismantle this structure. Under colonial law, the safety and role of Indigenous women was eroded over centuries and began with the colonization of Canada. The doctrine of discovery laid claim on the seizure of all lands inhabited by non-Christians, and further used violence to gain control and convert the colonized to Christianity, leading to further violence against Indigenous women. This ongoing epidemic of violence is at the root of the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada.
We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public education institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching and community engagement. Consider the key points of the commitment statement that you just heard. Are there pieces of Canada's history that you are now just acknowledging? Share with a partner.
Swale, Latte Tel Squee, Dishinakashun. My name is Pixie Wells. I'm here today, the president of the Fraser Valley Métis Association, and I'm honored to be here today and standing today on the traditional and unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Semá and Mathxwí people, and also the lodging home of the Fraser Valley Métis Association. I am honored to be standing here today to talk to you a little bit about what you just saw today and how that resonated with you and how we can walk forward together in Abbotsford School District. So as the Fraser Valley Métis Association president, we're very honored to have this opportunity to speak to you and your students and your families about how we can do this together. So we ask for you today to come here and walk forward together. As you've seen in the videos, there was an orange line that went through. And as we talk in our Métis world, we talk about weaving our stories together. And this is where we are today, is about learning Canadian history, the true Canadian history, and walking forward together and weaving together a new way of learning, a new way of educating each other and understanding the truths and the harms of true Canadian history. Again, with that weaving together, it's like the sash. All things come together if we walk together in a good way. And we ask again that you look at that and you take that weaving together as a community, as family units, as educational people, and as people in the community of Abbotsford and School District of Abbotsford. We have 3 rights-bearing people in this country: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. But knowing where you live today, I know where I live today. I've lived on Mathxwí territory for most of my life. But I'm also a proud citizen of Métis Nation, BC, and I'm also honored to be here and proud that the First Nations people took such good care of this land so that we can enjoy the presence of what it is today. So I ask you all again to humble yourselves, educate yourselves, learn something that you didn't know. And if you don't know, ask the hard question. We're here today, and there's lots of things going on within the school district and will be. If you don't know the answer, reach out and ask. Hi, merci. Have a great day. Thank you.
It's challenging to hear these truths, but we all play a role in creating welcoming and safe spaces for our students, families, and employees. Living our district's commitment to reveal and correct miseducation in your role and in your personal work is one way that we can all make a difference and walk forward together. Be open-minded to do things differently. Be vulnerable and admit failure when necessary, and then move ahead. Be an ally in your professional and personal life. Speak up when you hear others perpetuating miseducation. Model appropriate language, terms, and respectful relations. Speak out if you see or hear Indigenous people being treated unfairly. Understanding Canada's history and how Indigenous people have been treated is true and hard to hear, but needs to be. Educate yourself and those in your sphere of influence.
Question your own bias. Know that there are things that you do not yet know. We were all raised in a colonial system. We all need to learn the truth about Canada's history and become involved with Indigenous education. Challenge your assumptions and things you take for granted. Ease of travel, positive experiences in health, education, and in your day-to-day life.
Know that Indigenous people are diverse and have different experiences and are on their own personal journeys of healing. Do not put the person that you know that has Indigenous heritage to be the spokesperson for all Indigenous people. Reconciliation can't happen without first knowing the truth. What are some things that you learned today? What resonated with you? And what commitment to action will you take? There are resources to help you and professional development offered throughout the year for all employees in our organization. Visit indigenous.abbeyschools.ca for more learning resources.
In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a report of calls to action, which include number 57. We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.
Canada, as a settler colonial state, was founded on notions of white as the superior, more civilized race of human beings, which justified a lot of the occupation and was the base foundation for policies like the residential school policies. And those policies and those thoughts carry forward today. We're not talking about a distant past.
We're always aware that there is a level of ignorance and racism that exists, kind of a constant, and you see that throughout history.
Back in this 1970, the university published a very racist article in one of the student papers, and thankfully there was a public outcry, and the student association was formed at the time.
When you go to a school every day, you want to feel safe there, and just knowing that racism exists towards you and your people, it's very hurtful.
One of our Indigenous students here was sitting in a class. This student wrote that in the class, her classmates and her professor, they were discussing the benefits of wiping out 1,000 Indians from South Indian Lake, and they were discussing that in her presence.
I started to encounter the racism, and I could see it. It was so overt because I just put up a slide saying improving the educational outcomes for Indigenous youth, and I would see teachers roll their eyes and get up and walk out of the room.
I would say that there are lots of struggles in terms of dealing with racism, but also, frankly, real resistance to the commitment with Indigenous peoples.
When we changed the system, decolonized, after a little while, they go right back and recolonize again.
There's an Indian Act that controls First Nations people in this country, and people don't even know about it.
Recently, the teepee that stands behind the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was heavily vandalized. It's very clear what that teepee is. It's a very visible symbol of Indigenous culture.
I think that it's really a literacy in Indigenous content that we need to move to in universities, but also in public service.
There is no Indigenous pedagogy without Indigenous peoples, and the ways that we practice those as a people is ceremony. Ceremony is not just a spiritual endeavor, but it's a mental, academic. So this framework, this institution has not often seen our work as intellectual, but it is very intellectual. It's Indigenous pedagogy in action.
Our path to reconciliation, I would say, is a difficult one.
It's a path that requires courage and love and honesty.
It's an ongoing process, but you can see it in moments on this campus that's really beautiful and important.
Part of decolonization, part of resurgence and reconciliation is being able to arm our students with the tools that they need to reclaim their identities as Indigenous people.
I think that the heart and the spirit of each student is the same, and that they're fighting for something really important, a reflection of, their ancestors' dreams.
It's my hope that people will see this as a beginning rather than an end. Will understand that it's a journey, it takes time, but it's worth the commitment, and that the future world that we can build for all Canadians and for Canada is predicated on finding a better way. And sometimes, as we all know, that means even we professors have to learn a little thing or two.
As part of our enhancement agreement, we have strengthened our partnerships with our local First Nations and Métis Association to support student learning and to help our teachers infuse Indigenous perspectives into our classrooms. We offer numerous professional development opportunities throughout the year to assist educators in implementing activities related to truth and reconciliation. We are grateful to the elders, leaders, and families from the Semá First Nation, Mathxwí First Nation, and the Fraser Valley Métis Association, Indigenous students and their families who continuously provide their counsel in relation to our programs and services. We will grow to be a better educational institution because they generously share their knowledge and stories with us. Kwasai.
What does reconciliation mean to you? Who do you think is responsible for reconciling? Share with a partner.
As we close on this virtual professional learning session, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you who participated. Throughout today's session, we delved into the histories, lived experiences, and perspectives of Indigenous communities. We heard from Indigenous leaders, knowledge keepers, and educators who generously shared their wisdom with us. We reflected on Canada's history, the dark chapters of our past, and the imperative to acknowledge and address these truths. As Superintendent, I hope that this session reaffirms the importance of our commitment of acknowledging historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. Truth and reconciliation does not conclude with this day. It is a lifelong journey that requires continuous reflection, dedication, and action. As a public education institution, we accept responsibility to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching and community engagement. We are committed to creating an organization that is inclusive, equitable, and respectful of all voices, cultures, and the land that we are on. Present beliefs, shaped by our upbringing and experiences, may impact our progress toward this vision, but the imperative here is clear. We must continue to learn, to unlearn, and to deconstruct beliefs that no longer serve the values of justice, empathy, and respect. We have learned that reconciliation is not a destination, but a process. It is about building bridges, forging connections, and providing space for healing. It is about recognizing the humanity in one another and acknowledging the rights, dignity, and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. I urge each of you to take today's lessons to heart and be agents of change within your spheres of influence. Let us continue to walk forward together, hand in hand with Indigenous communities, as we strive to create a brighter future for all. Thank you for your commitment to learning today and to your dedication to this vital journey of truth and reconciliation.
In the Abbotsford School District, we have Indigenous support workers that work with our Indigenous students at every school site and their families. Our enhancement agreement has 3 goals: student success, cultural identity, and advocacy with equity and access for the students. And that enhancement agreement came from collaboration and discussions with Indigenous families and Indigenous communities. It really guides how we work together. With the enhancement agreement, our Indigenous support workers are more actively supporting students on a consistent basis in school.
In order to have success with the students, you need to have a variety of people. So we need to have a dedicated role for the Indigenous support worker.
They're like their key person that they feel comfortable going to if anything's going on.
Being able to feel comfortable in the skin you're in, especially when there's been shame for years and now it's something to be proud of. Students feel more comfortable seeing older mentors that they can relate to.
When I was a kid, I had Indigenous support workers myself from elementary school to high school, and the way that they made me feel as a kid is exactly how I want to make the kids of today feel.
I slipped through the cracks. I didn't feel like I mattered. Many teachers who had told me that, I wouldn't amount to anything. So I really wanted students to never feel that way. I wanted them to know that they mean something.
I myself as a student struggled to be at school, and I had great mentors and support workers myself that told me that I had gifts to share, and I just ended up starting to work with the youth the ways that I wanted to be supported.
Building relationships is probably the key part of our role.
The student success all comes from relationships in order to feel culturally safe, academically supported, and in order to feel like they belong.
An Indigenous support worker may support a student with reading fluency. They might go into the classroom and they might be helping them with an assignment.
And we do all our supports and become a wraparound. The challenges, help with maybe finances, with academics, with transportation, food. We wrap our arms around them when they need a hug.
Every child should know that they're supported and they're heard, because a lot of kids feel unheard. So I want to lift them up in any way I can.
They also work with finding that cultural pride and cultural identity. Sometimes they'll share with the students and then the students will go home and share with their families, and it's something that was lost to the parents too.
We're actually creating connections to those families where it tells those families that they matter and that we're changing the education for the next generations so that they can be more knowledgeable, which gives them more power to make more change.
Indigenous support workers might also be collaborating with a teacher, and what stories can we bring in and how can we work together.
A cultural exhibit is educating not only the Indigenous students, but it's offered to everyone in the classroom. It's always presented from an Indigenous lens.
There's students that are non-Indigenous and they say that they respect the teachings and they follow the teachings even though it's not in their cultural background. The teachings can apply to everyone.
When you create that extra knowledge, you create an easier life for the Indigenous students.
Everything I do is inclusive, because at the end of the day, if we can just embrace everybody's differences, it would be a happier place.
What inspires me about being an Indigenous support worker is my coworkers as well. I love getting to know them, getting to meet them, learning about their similarities and their differences.
The work that we do every day matters. You see where these kids go after they're out of your hands. Like, I never thought I would be here, and here I am, and now these students of ours are making it also, and they're going even further, and that's what inspires me.
I think what inspires me the most is getting the opportunity to see the students grow.
But then for their families to call and say what a big difference that it's made in their life, it's really inspiring for me.
I want to impact children and make sure that they know that they can change the world and they're more powerful than they realize.
I love my job. I've seen so many sad stories with happy endings. So many students move on in their own individual ways, win scholarships and bursaries and apply for universities that they never thought they would attend.
The things that we're doing in the schools is making a huge impact. It's amazing. We're moving mountains.